All right, we are back here in the basement talking about books and drinking a little bit of tea. So, I got two here today. I'm going to try and get through this as quick as I can because neither of them are books I'm going to recommend, but I figured I would talk to you about them so that if they don't sound like what you want, you can avoid them. Climate Wise Landscaping, content wise, I don't think you're going to be led astray necessarily. I don't appreciate any book that kind of tells you have to do something that might be better left to the taste of a person, the preferences, and there's some of that with design stuff. That's not really a big deal. What I liked the least about this book is that it's relatively pretentious. It's it feels as though it's written by in some ways by like a high school guidance counselor in an 80s movie, um, but a bit more pretentious than that. And I don't know, I don't appreciate the formatting or the writing style, and perhaps you won't either. And that in mind, there are better, more supportive books out there, and I'm not going to recommend this one. On the upside for it, the authors Sue Reed and Ginny Steibolt live in very different areas. Sue Reed is in the Northeast in Massachusetts, and Ginny Steibolt's in the Southeast, Florida. So we get a different a differing pair of ecologies that they kind of talk about, which is nice, and I wouldn't mind seeing that in more books if I can't have more books that are specific to my ridiculously cold region. So yeah, it may not lead you astray, but I'm not going to recommend this book to anybody. And now we have Gaia's Garden, a guide to home scale permaculture, and this is my least favorite gardening book by far so far. My issues begin with the title right here. It says home scale, and I think realistically for most homeowners, this book is not going to be something that you can really follow. I'm rocking a third acre here in Minnesota, and I understand a big part of my property is taken up by a shaded front yard. And even if I cut down all of the trees up there, it's still going to be pretty shaded because of the house. And the house itself takes up a not insignificant footprint of our property. So my backyard isn't huge, it's not tiny, and I just wouldn't be able to follow through on what this book wants. If I decided to chop down a bunch of trees and some things like that, I might be able to squeeze more in. And we are going to cut down some trees, but only the ones, we're going to try and only cut down trees that are potential problems for either the health of our garden or the safety of our house. And, that's about it. So I have a friend who recently purchased a property that's 3/4 of an acre. His house has a much smaller footprint than ours, despite the fact that he has a much bigger garage that I'm jealous of. And his front yard is pretty small too. His backyard is immense. But he wouldn't be able to use this book either because his entire backyard is pretty shaded. And his neighbors own enough of the trees that are shading his property. There's nothing he can do about it. And it's blind optimism at best, willful ignorance at its worst, that kind of ignores the possibility of that in your yard. And now I know people with really shaded areas have unique challenges that they have to overcome, but honestly, it's not that unique. I mean, my front yard is too shaded to grow a lot of vegetables in. Um, my neighbors on that side of the house, they have a reasonably bright property and they have about the same size, but they are the only ones who have that in my neighborhood. And you know that's a huge thing to overcome. So the resource issue is kind of what we're talking about here. And that's the overarching theme of the problems I have with this book. It's the resources that it expects you to have available, and it varies. So some of the case studies it offers involve people who've been able to sink a significant amount of money into their properties. So one woman has a home in the desert. They bought the land and they were able to bring in soil amendments and plant fast growing trees and then fill in and create this amazing oasis. And that's incredible, and I'm super jealous, and I'm glad that there are people who are able to do that, but we will not be able to afford to do something like that. And even if we could, again, coming back to the sunlight, we have to contend with things that we can't control. So, every single case study talks about people who've had some significant financial ability to do things. The other thing goes to, so we talk about sunlight being a problem, finances being a problem, the scale of things expected. So, like, it talks about being able to create the possibility of creating an in-property gray water cleanup facility. That's not a huge part of the book, but it's there. It talks about, so one of the things that I really didn't love, so it's kind of a double thing here. Zones and sectors. It wants you to divide your property into zones radiating out from your house. The things closest to your house, zone 1, and then going out, the zones go up. And things that are closest to your house are the things that need the most work or that you will go to the most often. It's really not a bad concept in general. He says it's one of the tenets of permaculture, and it makes total sense if you have a big property. Again, leading back to my first issue. But it kind of ignores the fact that people are not always going to want everything up against their house, or may be too shaded next to your house, and any other number of issues. The other thing, the sectors, it wants you to essentially create a circular map with radiating, with zones, with sectors, pointing towards the things that you have to deal with coming from that area. So it uses an example of the ugly view sector where you see your neighbor's garage, and the fire sector where there's a chance of fire coming up, and things of that nature. And again, not necessarily a bad thing, but not necessary, and it mandates it, which is my issue with that. And it also sells it as sort of a magic pill, a silver bullet, like this is a thing that makes everything work. It's an important cog, and you have to do it, and it just assumes that you are doing it. And some people will. I'm not going to, and I think I'm going to be just fine. And perhaps there's hubris in that, and perhaps there's a chance I'm not being accepting enough. But, I just found it to be, I found it to be sold too hard, and on top of everything else, it just wasn't what I wanted from this book. And I'm gonna talk about one last thing that kind of ties into what I've already complained about, and then I will stop whining at you about this stuff. So, in two different instances in this book, it talks about what amounts to using your neighbor's property. So one of them is, it was like a water collection system that involved one person being allowed by their neighbors, if I recall correctly, to collect the downpour from their spouts, or it might have just been to put a holding tank somewhere on their property. Something that was, here is a thing I'm setting up permanently, and an important part of it involves being on my neighbor's property. And having great relationships with your neighbors and working together on these things is not a bad idea. It's something that you just need to be really careful of, and I think long term, when you're talking about something like being able to get a source of water, you shouldn't build a system around the assumption that you will always have the same neighbor, that they will always let you do this thing. So that wasn't something I loved. And he repeated that same thing when he got to the end of his book. Now, this book was originally written when he lived on a larger property. He moved to a smaller one, and in the second edition added some more stuff about permaculture on what he calls a smaller property. And I have the feeling that it actually might be something along the size of what I have in that latter section. And I was excited through the book, being disappointed by the fact that I wasn't going to be able to follow this stuff. I was excited to get to the end and hopefully learn how to scoop some of the things from earlier on onto a size that actually fit in my plate. So I get to the end, and what really stuck with me was so he talks about growing something and sharing with his neighbor, but being disappointed that he couldn't grow this other thing, and finding out that several of his neighbors all grew stuff that he wanted. And he tells you that you should try to consider your neighbor's property and their gardens as zones in your area, in your garden, because you guys can all share resources. And again, a wonderful thing to work with your neighbors. I very badly hope that I can share plants with my neighbor who wants to grow fruits and vegetables, doesn't necessarily have the time to invest that I do at the moment. And he's given me a couple of plants. Last year I dug up some gaillardia and some lilies from his garden, and those things are really nice, but they're not always sustainable. Again, you can't assume that your neighbor has this, that they're willing to share it, that they always will be. So it should be treated more as a pleasant gift than something to expect. And I don't know, it just like many of the other things in the book, it's sort of approached as something that you should just be able to do. And I don't like that. I think I've already said it. It's sort of a blind optimism, or at worst, willful ignorance towards realistic situations that people are going to be dealing with. So, yeah. All in all, climate-wise landscaping, maybe not the worst book you're going to pick up. You might like it, you might not. If you've not read anything about permaculture and sustainability and landscaping, read it if it happens to come across your desk. But definitely don't see it as the only resource that's out there. Gaia's Garden, if you have a big space and good sunlight, it might work for you, but I highly recommend avoiding it because it was just disappointing and not what I wanted. Although I mentioned it at one point in an earlier video, and I suppose I can say something nice about the book in that it has a number of really nice charts for different things about plants. So one of them is carbon to nitrogen ratios of compost items. and that's fantastic to have around. So I will keep my copy until I find another book that happens to have those things, and then I don't know, I may boot this out of my gardening library. Okay, on that note, let's see, I've got a couple minutes left on recording time, so I will just show you. I know you can't smell it, but my entire basement smells like a potting shed, and I love it. And it's because of this bag of rose tone. And that bag of rose tone, which is 18 pounds, is surrounded by a dozen bags of Espoma's organic seed starting soil, which I very much hope works well for me, because that is quite a bit of soil, especially with the other 4 bags that are up there. Our garlic is doing well. We've had a few more stalks come up. I think it's about 40 now, and I think we were at like 32, 33 when I first got the sprayer and showed you guys. So, yeah, doing all right. And on that note, we're going to end this very long video. So I hope you guys are doing well. Stay safe, stay warm, get excited for spring that's coming in several months, and yeah, have a nice day.